Good to go. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for the April session of the Livingston Diversity Council's online learning series, Learn, Love, Livingston, a dive into diversity, advocacy, economy, and empowerment. This is, I just counted, this is actually our 10th official session since we started Learn, Love, Livingston back in 2021 when online learning was the only option. And so I welcome you to our 10th edition. Super, super exciting. And what a great content we have for you tonight to celebrate that 10th session. So I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here. Just a couple of quick notes before we get started. Just a quick thank you to St. Joe's. St. Joe's Livingston is a Champion for Change partner for the Livingston Diversity Council, which means they not only financially support the activities of the council, but they also partner with us in activities, and we co-support board representation. So they have membership on the Livingston County Diversity Council Board of Directors, and then I sit on the St. Joe's Diversity and Inclusion Council as well. So they have really committed not only to donate money, but to do the work themselves. So it's been a really great partnership, and we want to thank St. Joe's for that. Also, a thank you to our Livingston Diversity Council Board of Directors. All of our board members are volunteers. They do this out of the passion and the goodness of their heart and their drive to make an impact and to make effective and positive change in our community. So I thank our board of directors, and specifically LDC has one of our community action committees is the Community Outreach and Education Committee, and that committee is really solely responsible for this Learn, Love, Livingston series since we started, as well as some of our other educational efforts and some training opportunities that we have, our workshop opportunities that we have coming up to be released really soon. So we're very much looking forward to that, and I want to thank our committee for making that commitment to the work and ensuring that we have enough support to move things forward. A little bit about the Livingston Diversity Council. We've been around for 35 years this year, started in 1987 with a mission to be a change agent for diversity, equity, inclusion, and access that collaborates, educates, and empowers to build a thriving community. The Livingston Diversity Council's mission, our vision, is that we want to be a transformative community for Livingston County that embraces and empowers all people for their uniqueness and for their contributions. We know that this work is never done. So creating a vision statement that would be like, once your work is done, what will things look like? The work is never done. We're always going to be learning. And if you follow us on Facebook, you'll see that that's a really common theme through a lot of our posts, is that we are constantly learning. There will never be an end to the learning. So we need to be transformative and willing to change. And as humans, that's hard. And we're seeing that more and more these days. But we, along with folks like you, can continue on with our mission and creating that vision so that all folks are created equal and be embraced and valued for all their contributions that they make in our community. If you aren't already on Facebook or Instagram, please feel free to follow us at Livingston Diversity and at Pride Alliance Livingston, which is one of our community action committees. They have kind of their own mission statement, their own activities, their own committees, but they are still supported by the Livingston Diversity Council as the 501c3 organization. Email and website is on there. Obviously, most of you that are on here know where to find us, but if you don't, there's where to find us. And so without further ado, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. I am so very excited to be able to introduce Dave Serio from the Arab American National Museum. The Arab American National Museum is located in Dearborn, Michigan. It is the only national museum in the country, and we are so lucky that it is so close to us. And there's some beautiful pictures of the museum, and I can't wait, now that things are getting a little bit back back to normal, we're going to schedule a field trip very soon to come out and visit in person. But Dave's partnered with the Livingston Diversity Council a few years ago, and I'm so glad to be able to partner with you guys again. So thank you so much for being here, Dave, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's really great to connect with you all again and the great work that you all are doing. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm Dave Serio. I am the Curator of Education at the Arab American National Museum, which is located in Dearborn, Michigan, as was just mentioned. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to take us through a presentation about the Arab American National Museum, kind of who we are, what we do, what we're all about, why we exist, and all that. I'm also going to ask some questions as well. I try to be as interactive as possible with my presentation. So I'm going to be a little bit interactive. We're going to have some conversations and I'll be asking you all some questions as we go throughout. So the first thing I like to do, of course, is get a show of how many folks are aware of or have been to the Arab American National Museum before tonight. And you can use the chat, but since we're a small group, you can also unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Never.
Never, okay. Not yet, okay, I like that answer, not yet. Not yet. Okay. So since not everybody's familiar with us, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to show a short video that I believe I worked the sound out. And then after that, I'm going to jump into a brief, like a presentation that'll showcase a little bit more about the museum. And we'll have some discussions on some really big topics. So I'm going to show you a short video. If you can't hear the sound or if there's any issues, please let me know. I can also set it in the chat. It's about 2 minutes long. I think it'll give you a good sense of the Arab American National Museum, kind of who we are, what we do, why we exist. And then I'll jump into my presentation.
Among the 35,000 museums across the United States, there is only one museum that tells our story, and only one museum that elevates the Arab American voice and inspires the generations of today and the generations to follow. A thoughtful narrator of history, a passionate advocate of justice, and an innovative expression of our identity, the Arab American National Museum has served as the heart of Arab American storytelling, making its mark in the world of art, science, and culture. Brought to life by Access in 2005, the creation of this crown jewel and Smithsonian affiliate was guided by Access's vision of a just and equitable society that includes the full story and contributions of Arab Americans. Emerging as a powerful reclamation of our narrative in a space that has been dominated by ignorance and misconceptions that have threatened our cultures, traditions, and truths, the Arab American National Museum preserves our story and shares our contributions with the world. Locally and across our nation, we offer a history created by you to sustain a future that will be built by you. Since the very beginning of time, storytelling has been a way for us to navigate and discover our world. It is what heals us, unites us, and inspires us. Whether it is stories, songs, paintings, photographs, films, textbooks, novels, or poetry, the beauty and contributions of our unique and remarkable community are captured through the history and art that live on in our treasured Arab American National Museum.
All right, so I think that gives you a pretty good look at the Arab American National Museum and kind of things that we do and again, why we are around. And so I'm going to jump into my presentation now that I think will highlight a little bit more about the museum. And we're going to take a look at a few kind of major areas. We're going to take a look at the different countries that are considered to be Arab and why those countries are Arab. And the countries that many Arab Americans will trace their roots to. We're going to talk a little bit about Arab immigration to the United States, looking at 4 distinct time periods. We're also going to take a look at a little bit about Arab culture, some Arab stereotypes, and then kind of wrap up from there. Also, before I forget, again, happy Arab American Heritage Month, which is really exciting. And also because of the uniqueness of where we're at, wishing folks who may be observing Easter, Passover, and Ramadan a very happy holiday season, since all 3 of them have kind of coincided at the same time, which is interesting. So the Arab American National Museum. So we are, again, the first and only museum of its kind in the entire country doing the type of work that we are doing. We are here to document, present, and preserve the history, culture, and contributions of Arab Americans. We see ourselves as more of like a cultural touchstone, right? We mean a lot of things to different people. And so we see ourselves as a cultural touchstone so that people can take what they will from the museum, whether it's our educational offerings, whether it's seeing themselves reflected in the exhibits or our public programs, so on and so forth. As the video mentioned, we are a Smithsonian affiliated institution, so we do a lot of work with the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. We are also accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. So if you're in the museum world, those are 2 really amazing and impressive things to have under your belt. And we've achieved both of those things within our 10-year mark. And we opened our doors May 5th, 2005. So we're just coming up on our 17-year anniversary. And lastly, we are an institution of access, which has been around for about 50 years, providing social services to everybody and anybody who might need assistance in the community. And so the need for the museum grew in the late 90s, early 2000s, where folks in the community got together and they said, hey, there is nobody in the US that's telling our story and documenting it in a way that we can tell future generations. There's no really major organization collecting these artifacts, oral histories, exhibitions. Let's create a museum or an institution to tell our story. And that's really where the idea came from. It's just a place for Arab Americans to see themselves reflected in the exhibits and also house the stories of Arab Americans across the country. Now, when we talk about Arab Americans, and we're going to talk a lot about Arab Americans, obviously, when you hear that term Arab American, what are some things that pop into your mind? What's the first thing? And I'm not looking for any specific answers, but in general, what are things that might pop into your mind if you hear the term Arab American? And again, feel free to use the chat or feel free to unmute if you'd like to. Okay, so possibly some specific clothing like hijab or other, physical garb that one might see. Okay, good. What else might come to mind?
I tend to think brave, Dave, that's, when I think of the Arab environment, as arid and, oh dear, and a whole different kind of environment. I think it's brave to move someplace that's cold and green and just very totally environmentally different.
Okay, that's a great observation, right? So this idea of maybe brave and bringing themselves or their families to a totally new environment that might be very different from what they're used to. Okay. And I'm seeing in the chat from Cindy, like still early generational immigrants as identifying with both cultures. So people who came not too long ago, but some who came a while ago, but regardless having like those dual identities, that Arab culture and American culture, kind of a fusing of the two. That's good. All excellent answers, right? And so there's lots of things that come to mind when we think about the term Arab American, and we're going to unpack some of those today in our program. What we're going to do first, though, is I always like to do a little bit of an icebreaker, if you will, a little bit of an activity. And I'm going to show you a series of a few different slides, and on each slide, you'll see 2 individuals. What I'd like you to do is either tell me these people by name, if you know them by name, if you recognize them. If you don't, what can we tell about these folks based on their photos? So let's try these 2 pictures. Do you recognize either individual, and who are they?
Okay, so I know the guy on the right is an actor. I can't even tell you his name. Oh, that's right. Yes. There comes the name in the chat. I just
Yeah.
think of Monk whenever I see him.
That's accurate. And Matt has his name. So we have Tony Shalhoub here, who is Arab American. You've probably seen him in Monk or The Marvelous Miss Maisel, 13 Ghosts, Wings. He's been around for a little while now. And then on the left, as Cindy mentioned, we have a congresswoman. So we have Rashida Tlaib, who is the first Palestinian and one of the first Muslim American women in Congress that it represents a district here in Metro Detroit. So both identify as Arab American. They may come from different parts of the Arab world, be in different industries, may have differences in like age and things like that, but both fall under the identity of being Arab American. Okay, excellent. It's going to get harder. What about these two? Again, we might not know them by name, but what can we assume or tell about them based on these photographs?
The one on the left looks like 60s era.
Very good. So we can tell that these pictures are not taken yesterday, that
No.
they're a little older, right? So we have Arab Americans probably at this time, yeah, probably in the 60s, maybe 70s.
70s, yeah.
Okay, that's a good observation. What else can we assume based on these pictures? Maybe career-wise, what career or what industry might they be in?
I'm going to guess the woman on the right is a journalist. That's what I was just going to say.
Excellent. So we can tell that the woman on the right is probably in journalism of some sort, right? With her notepad, and there's a bunch of cameras there and recorders and things like that. Okay. And the guy on the left, we can maybe assume he's involved in science of some sort, right? He's got slides he's looking at. And so we have two Arab Americans. We have Ahmed Zawil, who's an Egyptian American scientist, very known for his work and actually won a Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry. And on the right, we have a journalist. We have Helen Thomas, who was a very famous journalist who has since passed. She was nicknamed the Watchdog of Democracy. And she interviewed presidents in her career from JFK up until President Obama. So a very long career. And so again, we have two Arab Americans here. Again, there might be some differences in terms of career and time frame and physical characteristics, but both identify as Arab American. What about these two? This might be a little easier. Again, do we know them by name or maybe like what industry they're in? Okay, very good, Cindy. Thank you. So yeah, the guy on the left is an actor and a singer, I guess, also technically. So you may have heard of him. His name is Rami Malek. He's a really famous actor. His most recent thing that I could think of at least was Bohemian Rhapsody, which I still haven't seen yet, but I heard was very good. So he's been around for a little while now, doing some really big movies and things like that. On the right, we have a hockey player, right? We may not know him by name. I'm not a huge hockey fan, but I do know of him, Justin Abdelkader, who used to play for the Red Wings. So again, both are identified as Arab American. A little bit of diversity here, but they both still fall under kind of that umbrella. What about these two? So I know the photo on the left is very generic. I acknowledge that. But you can see, there's a bit of diversity here, right? Oh, Claire, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that the one on the right seems like she might be an entertainer, a movie star. I don't know why. I'm going to take a stab in the dark. To the one on the left looks like a poet to me. I has that peaceful sense of being a poet, somebody creative.
Okay. Those are good guesses. Those are very good guesses. So yeah, on the left, we have, her name is Debbie El-Montazer. She's Yemeni American. She's based in education and activism. I do believe she actually dabbles a little bit in poetry now that I'm thinking about it also. So you are correct. But so she's well known for her work in education and activism in New York City. And then on the right, we have Bella Hadid. So the Hadid sisters have been pretty well known, I guess, in pop culture mainstreams. And so we have Bella Hadid, who's Palestinian Dutch American and was voted Supermodel of the Year a few years back. So again, both identify as Arab American and have different physical characteristics, come from different parts of the Arab world, but identify as Arab American. And I won't torture you with all of these, but again, you can just see more examples of Arab Americans, right? So again, a lot of diversity here. We have a musician whose name is Odyssey, whose family is from Sudan, which is a part of the Arab world. And Jeff Johns, who, if you've ever read any of the DC comics, such as Green Lantern, Aquaman, Flash, or Superman, you've probably read his work. I believe he also created the first Arab American superhero in the DC comic world. So really, really important guys. But again, a lot of diversity here, jobs, physical characteristics, skin color, things like that, but both fall under the umbrella term of Arab American. And so what does that mean? We keep referring to Arab Americans and we keep referring to some of these countries like Lebanon, Sudan, Yemen. So what exactly are we talking about? We are talking about this part of the world, right? So we're talking about the different countries that are considered to be Arab. And you can see they stretch over a really large swath of territory, right? There are countries in Northern Africa, and we have countries here in Southwestern Asia. Now, we're going to talk about a few different pieces of this, right? So how many countries do you think are represented here on this map? How many countries do you think are considered to be Arab countries based on what you can see? And I am not above cheating. You can, as long as you're using museum resources, you can cheat and count the countries.
I thought I counted previously and I came up with 17, but I don't know if I might be missing some.
You're close. 17 is a good starting point. I'm seeing from at 7 to 20. That's also a good starting point. It's a little higher than both of those guesses. So a little north of 20. Any other guesses? Some of the countries are very small, so it's also a bit hard to count sometimes. Any other guesses? Just north of 20. 32, a little higher, or a little lower. 22, very good. So there are 22 different Arab countries. There are 10 in Northern Africa and 12 in Southwestern Asia, which makes our 22 countries. And so there's a couple other interesting things with this map, right? So we don't use the term Middle East. Middle East is not the most accurate term if we're talking Arab specific related things, right? If you look at a map of the Middle East, you'll notice two really big differences compared to the map in front of you. The map of the Middle East leaves off most of the North African countries, and it includes countries like Iran and Turkey as Middle Eastern. But from our map, they're not listed as Arab countries. And so the map of the Middle East is really Iran, Turkey, Southwest Asia, maybe Egypt, and maybe like Sudan. But it leaves out most of the North African countries, and the Middle Eastern map adds countries that are Middle Eastern, but not Arab. And so the term Middle East is something that was really kind of created and coined by some of the European powers back in the day, especially Great Britain. And what they did is Great Britain really sectioned off the world as they saw it in relation to themselves. So anything very close to Britain was nicknamed the Near East. Anything very far from Britain, like China, Japan, and those countries, was nicknamed the Far East. And the Middle East just happened to be this blob of land kind of right in the middle of Britain's viewpoint, right? So the term Middle East, like the middle of who's Middle East, like, and it's really Britain's kind of perspective. So we don't use the term, we don't use the term Middle Eastern because it's not the most accurate if we're talking about Arab-centered, Arab-specific things, right? So we don't use the term Middle Eastern. So we use the term Arab world. Another popular term that has become really popular is the term SWANA, which is Southwest Asia, North Africa, which is a bit more inclusive. Some people are Arab, using the term Arab world is also not, it's popular than Middle East, but there's also folks that say, you know what, there are people who live in these 22 countries that don't identify as Arab. They may identify in a variety of ways. So using the term Arab also doesn't include them. So SWANA, or Southwest Asia, North Africa, has become a bit more popular because it gets rid of Middle East and it's a bit more inclusive to to identify folks geographically versus like by ethnicity. So, oh, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, so I have a question, Dave. Then you're, what is the definition of Arab? Or am I getting ahead of you? Or so, yeah, I guess I'm a little confused. Like, how are you how do you define Arab?
That's a great question. And you actually asked at the exact perfect time, because that was my next question to you all. It's like unpacking this term Arab. No, that's good. That's a good segue. So how does one define Arab, right? So there are three unifying factors that unify these 22 countries together and identifies them as Arab, and hence countries like Iran as not Arab, right? So what do you think unify these 22 countries together? What do you think an ethnic group or these 22 countries may share or have in common? And if it's easier to think about bringing it more back to the US. What lumps us together as Americans? What unifies us as Americans per se? That's a good observation, Cindy. So it's actually not, yeah, you're right. It's not religion. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. But so religion does not unify the Arab countries. In fact, as I mentioned before, there are all the three major monotheistic religions all have holidays currently, and you can find Arab Americans celebrating each of those, right? So you have Arabs who are Muslim, Christian, and Jewish celebrating all those current holidays. So that's a good observation. So if it's not religion, what else do you think, what could unify a group of people together?
Well, I think you tend to think government, but, or a military, you know, like protection or that kind of thing, but there's nothing like that with this group, right?
So actually you got probably the hardest of the three, which I don't think I've ever had anybody guess. You're on the right track. It's not political, like government wise, but all 22 countries do belong to a political organization called the Arab League. And so that's one of the unifying factors, is that they all belong to this Arab League, which was created in 1945 and helps with economic, cultural, and political issues. So you got the hardest one out of the way that nobody ever guesses. So the other two should be a breeze. Yeah, so that's the first unifying factor, is this like structure that all 22 countries and their governments really opt into. So that's one. And I'm seeing from Matt, possibly genetic heritage. Okay, that's part of it. That's part of it, is genetic heritage. What else though? And again, think about the US. We're all not genetically the same in the US per se. So what else could we possibly share?
Well, economies, yeah.
Not so much economy. Think about it from like person to person. What are we doing right now? Kind of.
Language?
We're talking, yeah, we're communicating, exactly. So language is one of our second unifying factor. So all 22 countries have Arabic as their official language. Even though you will find some other countries that have additional official languages like English and French, or certain dialects. Arabic language is the language that unifies these countries together. Now, anytime we talk about similarities, we also talk about differences, right? So same thing is true with Arabic. The more unifying aspect is very proper Arabic, right? It's the Arabic you'll find in like schools, in the newspapers. And this is the language that doesn't really change. In Arabic, we call it Fusha. In English, I guess we would call it like modern standard Arabic, like the proper Arabic. So if you're living in Algeria, talking to your friend in Yemen, and you both speak proper Arabic, you're able to communicate just fine. There's no major issues. There's no dialect issues. The differences really come with the dialects themselves, that can be very drastically different from place to place. So for example, my family is Lebanese, and if I'm going to use my Arabic and talk to people I'm going to use my slang. I'm not going to use proper Arabic. That would be very weird for me to talk proper Arabic. Just like nobody talks proper English with their friends, but if you're with the teacher or with a doctor or whatever, you may use proper English. And the same is true with Arabic, right? So I would use kifak, which I'll just type it in the chat if folks are visual. Kifak is basically, hey, how's it going? Hey, what's up? How are you? It's very casual. And that's very traditional for like Lebanese and Syrians and a few other places possibly, but it's mostly around this area. If you go to Iraq, instead of saying kifak or saying kifak, they would say shlonek, right? So shlonek is, hey, what's up? But it's very, very specific for Iraqis and for folks in Saudi Arabia, right? Pardon the spelling might be off. And then again, if we cross over into North Africa, if you want to greet someone, they would use the term washrak, which again is very drastically different from the other dialects, right? So again, there's a lot of differences with dialects from country to country, but also within each country, you'll find lots of different dialects from north versus south, urban and rural, so on and so forth. Again, very similar to the US, right? Think about English dialects outside of English, outside of the US, and also within the United States, right? There's lots of different dialects that we can find in the country in our country, but also like outside of the US. Okay, there's one other unifying factor. So we have language, we have the Arab League, we have the hard one. What's the other that last unifying factor that unifies people together? I'm trying to give you a hint. I don't like to give answers away, especially after you got the hard one. I have high expectations now. Okay. That's a good clue. If somebody asks you, what does it mean to be an American? Like what would you tell people?
I guess I might talk about like rights and freedoms.
Okay. So that's part of it, right? Rights and freedoms and things you may enjoy, traditions you may have.
Mm-hmm.
Claire, were you going to say something? I saw you unmuted. So let's take that. Let's take what we're probably about to do after this presentation, or maybe you did it before. We'll take food, we'll take clothing, we'll take all that and kind of bundle it up into like a shared history and culture, right? So culture is the third unifying factor. So all 22 countries have a shared history and culture. With culture, again, similarities, but also some pretty big differences, right? The easiest example, I think, is through food. And so hummus, for example, is a very easy food just because it's literally everywhere, whether it's an Arab restaurant or not. Everybody loves hummus, which is very delicious. What are the major ingredients used to make hummus?
Chickpeas.
Very good. So chickpeas and tahini, right? Which
Tahini,
is kind of like crushed sesame seed made into a paste. And then, of course, like lemon juice and garlic and all those other things. And so those ingredients you'll find all across the Arab world, right? You'll find chickpeas, you'll find tahini, garlic, lemon juice, all these things. What they do with those ingredients is really where you have the differences, right? So hummus, for example, is a very Lebanese, Syrian type of dish. And if you go to like Yemen, Sudan, Morocco, when you ask for a plate of hummus, it's not a part of the cuisine. They have the ingredients used to make it. They'll have chickpeas and tahini, but it's just they use those in other ways, right? So chickpeas, for example, in some of these other countries are used in like soups and stews. Sometimes they're like seasoned and ate as like a finger food by themselves. So again, each group kind of has similar foods, but also some pretty big differences when it comes to like food and other cultural characteristics, right? So these are our three unifying factors. So shared language, shared history and culture, and then membership in the Arab League, right? And if we look at Iran, which is often considered to be an Arab country, even though it's not. If we look at Iran, Iran, has a different language they speak, right? They speak Farsi, similar script, I think, but totally different language. They also have a different historical and cultural connection. If you talk to folks from Iran, folks are very proud of their Persian roots and their Persian ancestry. And then of course, Iran is not a part of the Arab League, right? So these three reasons are why the 22 countries are considered to be Arab, and other countries like Iran and Turkey are not considered to be Arab because they don't harness these three things. So, yeah. So, and then kind of continuing on with the conversation with religion. So the Arab world, again, while many folks identify as Muslim, you do have many other religions that you'll find in this part of the world. This is a really great map, I think, that's pretty useful, that highlights different religions found in the Arab world. And you'll notice probably a lot of green, right, which represents Islam. You'll probably notice a lot of green. But what's interesting is there's different shades of green, right? So there's different sects, ideas, traditions within Islam itself, lots of different ideas and pieces. And again, you'll also notice lots of Christians, right? So you'll see a lot of Christian population, a large Christian population here in Jordan, Palestine, all throughout Lebanon, many major cities in Syria, in Iraq. There's a huge Christian population in Iraq, especially here in Mosul in northern Iraq. We have Egypt, which has about 10% of Egypt's population is Christian. And then you also have Arabs who are Jewish, right? You have small but existing Arab Jewish communities in countries like Yemen, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and other places. And then again, you have Arabs who are connected to many other religions outside of those major monotheistic religions that predate Islam and Christianity in some cases, religions that come after these three major religions. And so my best example is, as an Arab American myself, I'm able to convert to 7 different religions in 7 days if I really want to, but I bring my Arab ethnicity with me, regardless of what religion I convert to or I'm a part of. And so this is our little cheat sheet here. Where, while again, many folks identify as Muslim, again, it's not 100%. And then if we look at the Arab American population, it's split, right? It's about 50% of folks who are Muslim and 50% of Arab Americans who are Christian. So it's pretty equal. And then if we zoom outside of the Arab and Arab American populations and look at the whole globe, you'll see that Arabs are a very small minority of Muslims that are worldwide. Arabs only make up about 15 to 20% of the Muslim population. So if Arabs are a minority when it comes to Muslims across the world, what region of the world or what countries have really large Muslim populations that you might know of? And if you don't know, that's okay. But are there any regions of the world that come to mind when you think of large Muslim populations? Very good. Okay, so Indonesia, right? Thank you, Matt. Indonesia is home to the largest population of Muslims on earth. It is a very heavily Muslim country, but not an Arab country, right? And very good, Cindy. Africa has a huge population of Muslims in Africa, in Northern Africa, as we saw, large, lot of, which are Arab countries, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, huge Muslim countries such as Nigeria. Nigeria is a huge country that has a very large Muslim population. US, in terms of the US, that's a pretty small number. In terms of the US, it's estimated that there's about 7 million Muslims or so in the US. That number is really hard to capture, but so it's a pretty small number when we look at the US compared to like other countries that have much larger populations. Yes, Claire.
So, okay, we're in a learning thing, so I'm gonna hope that nobody's gonna, judge me for this. But the interchanging the term Muslim and Islam, I had to double check. Are they the same, or how is it interchanged? So can you speak to like why is it if you follow Islam you're a Muslim? I don't hear can you elaborate? Sure. You get what I'm saying, Dave? Yeah,
absolutely. No, that's a good question. Yeah, and just before I get into that, like, please don't feel that there are any silly questions or that you might be embarrassed to ask. This is, like you said, this is a time and a space for learning. And if you don't ask now, you may have to rely on Google, which can sometimes not be the best, the best option. So now really is a great time to ask any questions. And that's a good question, right? So Islam is the religion itself. So Islam is like the actual religion, like Christianity is the actual religion. And then Muslim is somebody who is a follower of Islam. So Muslim is to Christian as Islam is to Christianity. So if you're talking about Muslims, you're talking about the people themselves, the people who actually follow the religion. And if you're talking about Islam, it's people, it's the religion itself. If that makes, is that helpful?
Yeah, I think when you think of Christianity and Christian, you see the base word in there. So I just didn't
Okay.
know if Muslim had a more elaborate definition to it that maybe we weren't aware of. So
Ah,
as a follower, or I'm
yes.
probably getting a little technical here.
No, you're good. Actually, you just made me, I've never really thought about it, but when you look at, so in Arabic, if you look at the root words, so Islam, has an S, an L, and an M. Islam, Muslim, they're kind of the same, right? Minus the beginning part. So Islam, the word itself is the religion. Muslim, when you put an M at the beginning of that word in Arabic, it means it's a noun, if you will. I guess it's kind of like when you have an M at the beginning of a word, sometimes in Arabic, it means you belong to that root word, and that root word is Islam. So that's actually a good point. You maybe just think about that. So Islam is the religion, and then when you add an M and a different, that sound in there, it basically means follower of this thing. So that's a really good question, actually. So grammatically, you're challenging my college brain of when I took Arabic courses, but that is how that's where that root word comes from.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, so to kind of wrap this up, our slogan here is that, so, I guess to wrap up the conversation about Muslims, so Indonesia and Southeast Asia specifically has the largest number of Muslims across the world. Of course, Africa as well, as was pointed out, is also notable and worth mentioning. But when we look at like region, Southeast Asia is home to the largest number of Muslims in the world, and specifically Indonesia as the country with the most. And then, of course, we happily deduce that not all Muslims are Arab and not all Arabs are Muslim, which of course is a really important point. And then if we look at religion a little bit more in the US, in terms of ethnically diverse faiths, you can see this really great graphic up here by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or ISPU. They do a lot of work specifically with the Muslim American community. And I think this is really interesting because it highlights a couple of important points. The first one is that if you look at Muslims, they're very diverse, especially when we look at other religions, that the Muslim population in the US is very diverse. The second thing I think that's really interesting is that you notice that Black Americans or African Americans are the largest percentage of Muslims in the United States. And so again, even in the US, Arab Americans are a minority amongst the Muslim population. And so again, the largest majority of Muslim Americans are actually African American. And the ISPU is a home to a lot of really great resources if you do have any curiosities or questions beyond this point, but they're a really great resource to utilize. Any questions about this section before we move on? We've talked a lot. I feel like I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but we've talked a lot about like the 22 different Arab countries and what makes them Arab, religion, all that. Are there any questions about this section before we move on?
I do have another one, Dave.
Sure.
So the Arab League, we don't hear about them much like we hear about NATO or, different organized groups. Is the Arab League going to get more coerced or are we going to hear more from them? I just thought it was funny that none of us could answer that. And obviously they're a factor. How come we don't hear about them more?
It's a good question. With the utmost respect for the Arab League, it's not the most effective organization on earth. The Arab League is, like you mentioned, kind of like a NATO or kind of like a United Nations on a smaller scale, at least. And they tend to be a bit more effective than the Arab League. The Arab League, like I said, it does help out with economic, cultural, and political issues. It doesn't really it's not as effective, I think, as it could be. And I think a lot of it has to do with like competing interests and the fact that a lot of these countries have their own issues that they need to deal with versus, NATO that might be in a bit more of a position of power versus some of the Arab countries that are dealing with, war, political conflict, famine. Not that that's everywhere, of course, right? That's only in a few countries, but there's so many issues to handle. And a lot of it is invested in self-interest, in my own personal opinion, with my museum hat off. So I don't think it's the most effective. And I think it has a lot to do with just human nature of catering to my own country. But they do some things. As an example, they did kick with Libya, for example, when the war was going on, when people were rebelling during the Arab Spring and they were revolting against the leader of Libya, because of what the president of Libya was doing, the Arab League kicked Libya out of the Arab League as repercussions for what he was doing. I think they did the same thing with Syria. So they do things, but it's more Arab world focused versus like NATO and the United Nations, which is a bit more global, if that makes sense. It's a good question, though. Any other questions or thoughts before we move on? And if anything does come to mind, feel free to drop it into the chat, or we'll save a little bit of time at the end for questions. So moving on to Arab immigration. So now that we have the idea of where the Arab world is, we're going to move into Arab immigration to the United States. So we're going to highlight a few different pieces of Arab immigration. But before we get into that, I always like to preface with a couple of questions. So really quickly, how would you define an immigrant? What does that term mean? How would you define what an immigrant is?
I would say a person who leaves their country of origin to make a life for themselves in a new country.
Okay, very good. So somebody who moves from one country to another to make for a better life, or for a wide variety of reasons, right? And it's somebody who's intending to permanently live in that country, right? It's the idea of we're going there and we're going to live there, and all that. And exactly, everybody in the U.S. except for the indigenous populations, right? Except for the Native Americans. So that's also something to keep in mind to kind of ground us, is that many of us, most of us, are children of immigrants, right? What are some reasons people would move from one country to another?
My relatives moved for religious persecution and I think more opportunities.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so religious persecution, I'm seeing that in the chat as well. And opportunities are two really major reasons. Why else? Why else would people move from one country to another? Resources, better opportunities. Okay, good. Yeah, so there's lots of reasons people move from place to place, right? So, economics and education and war, political conflict, and, joining family and friends that already are living somewhere else, adventure. So these are tons of different reasons, right? And these are many of the reasons why many Arab immigrants came to the United States. Now, we won't do this as an activity. I always just like to think of, it's a good reflection, like thinking about, like, if we were all leaving our houses tomorrow, what items would you all want to pack in your suitcase? And I think it's just something to kind of think about. If you want to volunteer some answers, you're more than welcome to. But our goal at the museum really is to, not only insert the Arab American story into the larger fabric of history that sometimes gets lost, but to humanize these experiences of Arab Americans, right? Immigrants and refugees and folks who are coming for a variety of reasons. It's a very overwhelming thought, right? And it's an interesting exercise, because I think it gets us in the shoes of somebody who is an immigrant and had to, wanted to leave their country for a wide variety of reasons. And the trouble of like leaving your family behind and thinking about what you're going to pack with you. And you can't pack everything. You can pack, X amount of items, and knowing what's important, right? For some people, it's family heirlooms and photographs and jewelry and stuffed animals and things like that. For other people, it's, religious items, practical items like an Arabic to English dictionary in some cases, or, your passport and your IDs and your paperwork is something that's super important. So just some food for thought, something to think about, which I always think is an interesting activity. So there's 4 different time periods of Arab immigration. And the first one really where we see the first large bulk of Arab immigrants coming to the US is from the 1880s to the early 1920s. And it's mostly Christians coming from Greater Syria, which is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, kind of that area, and mostly coming for employment. It wasn't only Christians. You also have folks like Joseph Hawar, who are Muslim, who are immigrating to the US. And also, he was also very influential in helping to build the first mosque in Washington, D.C. So it's not just Christians, but it's mostly Christians from Lebanon and Syria. And do you think it's mostly men or women coming during this time? Mostly men, right? So it's mostly men coming during this time, although women also come up in larger numbers towards the latter part of the period, but for the most part, it's men. Exactly. Yep. Men usually go first and then send for their wives, which the Arab community is no exception. Although we in our museum's exhibits, we do have a few really interesting stories about women that left their husbands and kids behind and ended up coming to the US, finding work, and then sending money back to their husbands and kids, and then eventually brought them over. So while the narrative is very dominantly men come first, there are numerous stories about women coming first and leaving their men back in the old country and then eventually bringing them over. So, and we have a few of those stories in the museum. And so in the 1920s, there's a series of restrictions put on immigrants, really stopping the first time period of Arab immigration. What's really interesting, and I won't get too far into this because I'm a history nerd, but I know it can be, there's already so much to talk about. But what's interesting is if you look at what's going on in some of these Arab countries or what's happening with US policies, this is really why these time periods start and stop, either again with US legislation or political issues or things happening in the Arab world, whether it's economics, politics, war, what have you. So at the end of the first time period, we see restrictions placed on immigration from the US. And that leads us to our second time period, which is much smaller in terms of who's coming and in terms of numbers. And it's made up of 2 major groups. The first group is something called folks coming as part of the brain drain phenomena. What types of folks might be coming during this brain drain phenomena? And you can use the photo to the right of you as a context clue. Very good, Cindy. Educated, right? So it's a lot of very highly educated folks that are coming during this time. Took the words right out of my mouth, Matt. Doctors, scientists, engineers, researchers, students. So the US is very kind of picking and choosing who they want to come over, right? And it's people that can contribute to American society. So that's the first part. The second part are Palestinian refugees, right? So because of what's going on in Palestine during this time, many Palestinians are forced to leave their home. They're expelled from their homes, and many Palestinians come over. And again, it's also connected to US legislation. We see US legislation that's passed that called the Refugee Relief Act that allows Palestinians to come over in the 50s because of what's going on. And so again, a much smaller wave and a bit more selective versus the first time period, which is a little bit more open just to folks who want to come here. We're also seeing refugees starting to come over here during the second time period, which is also a little bit of a change. And then this brings us to our third time period of immigration, which is from the 1960s up until about the 1990s. And you have folks coming for, again, many of the reasons that we had mentioned. And you're also seeing during this time really where the US is starting to get its Arab American identity in some really big cities, right? You have Arab Americans coming back in the 1880s and way even further than that. In fact, you have Arab speakers who are coming as early as the 1500s, which is another exhibit at the museum, which I'll tease you with in hopes that you'll come and visit us. But this is really during this time period where the Arab community really starts to get defined, and we start to see really large populations coming to the Metro Detroit area and other big cities like New York, Houston, Chicago, LA, so on and so forth. And that has a little bit more to do with US legislation and things going on overseas, right? So we see larger numbers of folks coming because of the Hart-Celler Act that is passed in 1965, gets rid of some of the restrictions we saw in previous time periods and makes it a little bit easier for folks to come. We also see at the same time happening is the Lebanese Civil War, where you have a lot of Lebanese people leaving Lebanon and coming to America and many other places. You also have the Iraq-Iran conflict in the 80s, which again sends many Iraqis to come to the US and so on and so forth. But again, you have people coming for family reunification, education, economics. You still have immigrants coming during this time as well. And then our fourth time period takes place in the 1990s up until present day. And this has a lot to do with US legislation. With the U.S. invasion of Iraq in direct or indirect intervention in the Arab world. So the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 is a really unfortunate but good example of this, right? When the U.S. invasion of Iraq happened in 2003, many Iraqis, again, in this time period come to the U.S. and flee for war, and because of war and political conflict and also lack of economic opportunities due to sanctions and things like that. And so we have our four time periods of immigration, kind of who's coming and why people are coming, just kind of like snippets. Now, looking at this map, what state would you say has the largest overall population of Arab Americans in the country? So what state in the country has the biggest population of Arab Americans? Michigan is a good guess. Michigan is actually number 2 in terms of statewide population, but it's a good guess. This is a trick question, so that's a very good guess. New York is also a good guess. New York is number 3. Good guess, though. What other state would you think has really big populations of Arab Americans? California. Very good. Thank you, Cindy. So California is home to the largest population of Arab Americans in the entire country. Michigan is number 2, and New York is number 3. And California has large populations because California is a very large state and has large numbers of everything. And so many Arab Americans are in California, but they're much more spread out, right? They're found in big cities and in the rural areas, but they're much more spread out versus in Michigan, which is home to the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the entire country. So Michigan is home to the largest concentration of Arab Americans. Yes, Claire.
Yeah, Dave, is there a reason? Like, I mean, you have a choice of 50 states. Do we know why the settlement ended up that way at all, or?
We do. That's a really good question. And so one of the major reasons, there's two parts to that, I guess. The first reason is the auto industry, and that's the main reason. So a lot of people came initially to Michigan because of the auto industry, because of jobs, good paying jobs at the time. Also good for English skills. You didn't need to be fluent in English to work in the auto industry. So there was that. We've also heard, I won't say we've learned, because it's kind of through community storytelling, but we've learned through some community storytelling that we've done that it was said that Henry Ford sent recruiters to countries like Lebanon and Yemen to actually get workers from those countries to bring them to work in his factories. So there was a deliberate outreach to the Arab world to bring workers here. But, in general, Arab Americans came for the auto industry. And then from there, you have growing communities, right? If I am an immigrant and I get to choose where I want to go, I'm not going to settle in, Idaho or Wyoming where there's not a big community. I'm going to go where I can find a community, right? Where I can find people that speak Arabic, where I can find people who maybe have open grocery stores and restaurants that cater to my taste buds that I can find religious institutions that cater to me. So that's kind of the second piece, which is not as the major reason, but it's still a major reason why you have folks continuously coming to Michigan. Oh, interesting. Oh, that's cool. I did not know that. So I'm seeing Cindy's comment in the chat. Yeah, so that's awesome. So yeah, it's not necessarily just like the Arab American community or like the auto industry, but apparently other industries did that as well. That's interesting. I wonder the reason behind like recruiting like the Croatian population. That's really interesting. I know for like the Arab with Henry Ford sending people, recruiters to Lebanon and Yemen and those countries, I know that was self-serving. So again, the story goes is that apparently some of the folks that were working at the auto factories would show up drunk to work. They wouldn't be very productive. They'd be hungover. And so he wanted to get people who he assumed didn't drink, like people living in the Arab countries. And that was one of his reasons why he targeted the Arab community overseas. What city in California is the largest population? Oh, that's a good question. So I believe the Los Angeles area has the biggest population of Arab, the largest population in California, which again kind of makes sense just because it's huge. It's a huge sprawling area. But I think LA and the San Francisco area are two of the biggest areas in California with large Arab populations. Really good questions. Yeah, so that's a little bit about Michigan and kind of why Michigan specifically. Just some information. You can see the numbers of Arab Americans increasing year after year. The vast majority of folks are living, of course, in Wayne County, around Metro Detroit area, including Dearborn, and then followed by Macomb, Oakland, and then Washtenaw and Ingham counties. Again, major cities there, makes sense. The numbers continue to go up. And you can also see here just a snapshot of the different populations, kind of who's living where, right? And again, we talked about people wanting to come to Metro Detroit in general because of like restaurants and religious institutions and community already here. And that gets broken down even smaller, right? So it might be a little hard to see, but you can see, you know, that folks are kind of in communities kind of self-segregated based on maybe religious affiliation and based on country of origin. Right. And that makes sense. Right. So again, off to the, east side of Detroit and here into southern Macomb County, it's primarily Lebanese, Syrian, and Egyptian Christians. Right. And so if I'm a Yemeni Muslim, I'm not going to settle in Mount Clemens where I'm going to have to drive to find, a religious institution, where I'm going to have to drive to find Yemeni restaurants versus like Hamtramck and Dearborn, where there's lots of Yemeni restaurants and coffee shops that have popped up. So I'm going to go where I can cater to my language, right? We talked about dialect. There's lots of different dialects. So Lebanese dialect is very different from Yemeni dialect. And so again, based on those three major reasons, language, religious practice, and like food and restaurants and things like that, you're going to go where your community is. There's not necessarily anything like issues with religious tension or anything like that. A lot of it is just the needs of these folks. And you'll see, like, again, a dark spot here in Hamtramck, which represents the Yemeni population. Also in Dearborn, it's primarily Muslim versus the east side here, which is mostly Christian. Obviously, this is changing, so this isn't stagnant. You do have Muslims on the east side here in Macomb County and Detroit. You do have Arab Christians here in Dearborn, but primarily it's mostly Lebanese, Iraqi, Syrian Muslims. This spot right here is also the Yemeni population, which is concentrated into a very specific area of Dearborn and also getting into Allen Park and the Melvindale community. And then again, you can see up here, we can see like a huge Iraqi population here in Sterling Heights and Troy and out into Oakland County, where there's many, many Iraqis, both Chaldeans and also Iraqi Muslims as well. So again, you can kind of see how folks are kind of self-segregating based on just different needs they may have. One of the reasons, which we already talked about, is the auto workers. So again, this is the major reason why folks came to the Metro Detroit area. And they actually followed Henry Ford around. Anytime he would kind of open a factory, they would move into that area, like really close, whether it was Highland Park or Dearborn or where have you. So we talked a little bit about this. One of the other jobs that was really attractive for Arab immigrants was peddling, right? So a lot of folks would become peddlers. They would go door to door and sell different items, such as linens and textiles and fabrics and things like that. Again, this is not something super unique to the Arab American community. The auto industry brought a lot of communities to Michigan. Peddling was also something that was taken up by a lot of other immigrants. It was pretty easy money. You could be your own boss, and you didn't need a ton of English to be a peddler, right? So this was very attractive, not only for Arab immigrants, but for many immigrants. And then through there, you have folks that stopped going door to door to sell goods and started opening up corner shops and markets and grocery stores, right? And so you can see from this kind of image here and this text here that about in the 1920s, so about 100 years ago, there's at least 300 grocery stores owned by and operated by Arab Americans in the city of Detroit alone, which is a huge, huge number, I think. And even looking at this snapshot, you can see, if you know Arabic names, there's quite a few names that sound very Arab. So Abu, Abdunor, Abdin, Abu Dahar, Abud, Abraham. So very Arab sounding names, even just in this like snapshot of this directory. So entrepreneurship has been around and alive very much so amongst the Arab American community for many, many, many years. And a lot of it has to do with what they used to do overseas. People were business owners. They would bring that business here. So again, nothing super unique to the community, but again, entrepreneurship is alive and well in the Arab community. And that leads us to, present day, where you have tons of restaurants and grocery stores and, clothing shops and spice shops and all kinds of things existing in Dearborn. One thing that we do at the museum that we work with these businesses on is we do our Yella Eat food tour. So it's a culinary walking tour where you're able to sample like 4 or 5 different restaurants' cuisines. And so what's really cool in Dearborn is we have a lot of Lebanese restaurants, but there's also some Syrian restaurants, Iraqi restaurants, Yemeni restaurants. So it's a really great way to get to know the city of Dearborn, but also get to sample a bunch of cuisines that you might not otherwise be familiar with. So we do a couple of walking tours. We have a couple coming up in May, and we'll be doing some more over the summertime. So I hope that you'll stay tuned to the Arab American National Museum and all the events that we have coming up. But that's just a snippet as to a little bit about one of our really cool and very, very popular programs. I think I might end here with these next couple of slides, just because it's getting, it's a little after 8 and I want to be respectful of folks' time. I know we have until 8:30 and I'm happy to continue talking, but I do want to leave time for some questions and discussion. But I think we'll kind of, we'll finish up this part and then we might wrap up if that's okay. So generosity, and again, one of the reasons that these restaurants exist is because it's all about food. It's all about hospitality and welcoming people into your home. And so we'll start this way. Hospitality, again, is not something that's a unique Arab American feature, but it's something that you'll find in many cultures. When you all have guests that come over to your house, what are some normal things you might do when you have people coming over?
Well, I think always offering food or drink, right?
Absolutely. Always offering something, right? You don't have to offer your whole fridge, but usually it's, can I get you something to drink? Would you like some snacks, or here's a meal I prepared, what have you? Okay. What else do you all do when you have people that come over? Is there anything else you might do? And I'm not looking for any specific answers. I'm genuinely asking, since you're the keepers to your home, so you know better than I do. Well, I know for Arab Americans, we will clean our house from top to bottom, right? So we always make sure our house looks nice and clean and is very presentable. We'll, kind of roll out the red carpet for our guests. So we'll welcome people with food. We always break out the fancy plates and cups. We don't use paper plates just because, we want to make sure our guests have the best of everything. So there's a few things that we do. And again, this is not unique to the community, but it's definitely a big part of the community. So generosity and hospitality is very much alive in Arab culture. If you ever go to an Arab American household, you'll often be fed very, very well. so it's always my recommendation when I do these presentations, if you don't have any Arab friends, that you make Arab friends, because you are fed very generously. You're fed very, very warm, you're very welcomed with food into their household. So, but again, food is again a huge part of hospitality. Oftentimes there's a process, right? So you're fed, oftentimes you'll start with like some nuts and sweets and dates. Not sweets, nuts and fruits and dates, and then you'll go into appetizers like soups and salads. Then you'll go into the main entree, and then you'll end with sweets, maybe baklava, and then you'll end on like coffee and tea. And coffee and tea has some really major social importance. So oftentimes, if you go to an Arab person's house, you'll be given coffee and tea at the very end. There's a trick for that, right? Because coffee and tea is a very hot drink, so you can't just down it and like take off. You need to wait for it to cool, and you kind of sip on it. And this creates for more engagement, more food, more conversation. So it's a way for us to signal to you like, hey, we're enjoying your company. We want you to stay longer, right? And again, the community is very diverse, right? So just because one group of Arab Americans will make this photo like you see of food anytime one person walks in, doesn't mean that's going to be the case for everybody, right? So my grandparents, for example, would make huge spreads of food for anybody that's coming over, because again, it's a way for us to like show that we're excited and that you're here. I myself, for example, won't do that. I might make some tea or offer some tea or coffee, and then maybe throw out some snacks. So it really depends on who's coming, and it really depends from person to person, household to household. I always like asking this question because I'm a big foodie. I'm always curious though, what types of food, Arabic food, have you all tried, or is maybe your favorite?
I am partial to the Lebanese fare, more of the hummus and the chicken and the rice pilaf. And I do have to agree with Cindy, the baklava is also a
Yes.
a weak area.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, good. So hummus and the chicken and the rice, the pilaf, the shawarmas, the baklavas, all very good, all very, very good stuff. So I always do my little foodie challenge if folks are interested in if folks are very experimental with food. I always recommend something called kibinaya. I'll type it in the chat. Spelling varies because it's hard to translate something with exact English spelling in a different language, but kibinaya is my favorite food. So as I was mentioning earlier in the map, like each country has like similarities, but also like really different cuisines. And kibinaya is something that's very Lebanese, maybe Syrian, but it's very Lebanese. And what it is, it's a raw lamb dish. And I know it sounds very weird, but the meat for the kibbeh is ground so fine over and over and over again until it's almost like silky smooth. And you season it with spices, and you add some salt, and you'll chop up some onion and put some olive oil on top, and you'll take a little pita bread and make a little sandwich out of it. It's really, really good. I know the idea of eating raw lamb is something that's probably not the most appetizing to everybody, but again, if you're very adventurous, I highly recommend it. It's delicious. It sounds amazing. Thank you. It's very good. Again, it sounds weird. I've had some crap from other Arab Americans who are not Lebanese, and they're like, that's really gross. Like, I don't know why Lebanese people would eat raw lamb. That's weird, but it really is. It's very delicious. So if you're up for an adventure, I always recommend doing kibinaya. So, and then lastly, I guess to kind of wrap up the presentation is this idea of collectivism and being very close-knit. So Arab Americans tend to be very close-knit. Family is a huge piece of being Arab American. Again, not something that's drastically jaw-dropping. Other communities, this is the same way, but again, just something that's worth mentioning. There's this idea of, individuality in America, which again is not a bad thing. It's just, a lot of times it's like, I'm my own person. And when I move out, I'm moving out of my house at 18 because I'll be an adult by then. And that's cool. And many Arab American families, there's this idea of collectivism and extended family, right? So it's this idea of you are your own person, yes, but there's also your family, your extended family. And extended family means, aunts, uncles, cousins, second, third, fourth cousins. It means people who are from your village back home, but are not blood related, but they're still family. So there's this idea of just like collectivism in this very close-knit community. Also, reputation is also a really, really big thing. So Arab Americans consider reputation to be very, very important. So you're kind of a reflection of your family, right? So that's why reputation and name is very important to a lot of folks. And again, there's this idea of, you know, broader concept of like, you know, family dynamics, right? So if you ever go to an Arab wedding, for example, which if you have not been, super fun, but those weddings can get to be as large as 6, 7, 8, you know, 100 people, sometimes 1,000 people. And again, it has a lot to do with the community, right? So you invite everybody who's a part of your community, even if they're not blood related, or if it's your parents' friends and you've never met them, they're still part of the family, you invite them. And so families can be very, very large because of that reason. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm actually going to go back into my presentation, and I'm going to go to the end of it just so that you can see my contact information. I'm going to skip a couple slides, but I will reshare my screen, and then I will pass it back to Nicole to close us out. But so this is my contact information. I do hope that you'll connect with myself and the Arab American National Museum in the near future. You know, so please visit us. There's our website. We have tons of different programs going on all the time, free and some that cost, but a lot of free programming, a lot of family programming as well. So we do like family parties around major celebrations. So like Eid, which is the Muslim holiday, we do a Halloween party and a Christmas party. And you can always keep up to date with everything that's going on at the Arab American National Museum by, again, going to our website or following us on social media. So I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I hope you learned a little something. I hope it was interesting. I know it's a little weird on Zoom, but I do hope that next time that we do this, we will be in person at the Arab American National Museum. So thanks again so much, you guys. And Nicole, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. As always, well above expectation. You covered a whole bunch of stuff that I've been thinking and trying to figure things out. Claire is always great to bring up the questions that I think of after the session. So that's when I love that she's always here. So I really just appreciate it. And I one of the things that the Diversity Council had talked about doing in early 2020 was that we would do like 4 field trips a year where we would just invite the community to go out together and learn some things. And the Arab American National Museum was on our short list, and then COVID happened and we kind of went, oh, well, we're not going to do that. But I'm really looking forward to an opportunity to really talk about doing that again. And so I really can't wait. I did check out the website of those food walking tours and was really excited about that. Because if I can't get anybody excited about diversity, like you bring in food and okay, now people are interested, right? So
Exactly. And Nicole, if you ever wanted, we could curate a special one for your group. You could join one that exists, but we could also do a curated food tour. So just let us know. We're happy to accommodate.
Wonderful. That would be great. Thank you so much. Awesome. So I always end our programming with a call to action, just some things to do for folks to jump in and join. Again, our Facebook and Instagram, our upcoming events. May 18th is our next Learn, Love Livingston. Our content is still kind of being tweaked just a little bit, so it's a surprise. June 15th, in honor of Pride Month, we are offering a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus, so LGBTQ plus 201. We have a 101 session that we've done. 201 is creating safe spaces and safe places. Pride Month is June, so watch our website and Facebook for upcoming events. We've got our Pride Parade is just being considered with a civic event application by the city. We'll know next week. We are also holding our rainbow reception in downtown Brighton, trivia, scavenger hunt, all kinds of cool stuff planned for June. Check out our YouTube channel at Livingston Diversity, which is where our recorded sessions are held. The Pride merchandise store is now open as well, and that's linked all over our social media. So if folks are interested in buying merchandise for Pride Month, membership obviously are all our welcome. Cling. And then my general, just everyday kind of reminders: support other initiatives that you're passionate about. Start brave conversations, because gosh knows they're brave right now. Any kind of conversation needs to be brave because it can go in all different kind of directions. And to live, love, and learn intentionally, we can't really do anything by mistake anymore, and know that there's a reason for the reason, the way things are happening, and why you're involved and why you're invested and why you're here. So make sure that those are intentional as you move forward. And then last, just my contact information. So, feel free to reach out to us at the Diversity Council for anything else. I'm going to stop my screen for just a second because I didn't save my stuff in the chat here. Oh, all right. So we're going to just stop that real quick. Okay. I'm going to go back to I'm going to put this, I just can't get to it. Okay. While I'm messing around with the screen and making, things weird, feel free to pop on and ask any questions that you might have for either myself or Dave. All right. What I just put in the chat was our session evaluation. So if folks just want to jump on and make some notes, let us know what you thought of tonight's session. If there's other things that you think would be really interesting, we're always looking for ideas, programs to highlight. There are so many resources out there that I think there's no way that all of us can know, but collectively we can come up with some really cool experiences for folks. So, whatever you want to tell us, we are certainly here to listen. So we very much appreciate you being here this evening. And unless there's anything else, we'll see you at some upcoming event. And hopefully one of those is going to be at the Arab American National Museum when we go for a food tour.
That sounds perfect. I'll be waiting. I'll be waiting for you all.
Sounds great. Great. Thanks all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. That was great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. See you at the museum, hopefully.
Sounds good.
Oh,
Thanks.
absolutely. Yeah.